All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Quesada, senior reporter at WPTV. I hope everyone's having a wonderful Monday afternoon. It's the lunch hour. Hopefully, you're grabbing a bite to eat and tuning in to learn a little bit more about COVID-19 and employer rights. So, joining me today is labor and employment discrimination attorney Arthur Schofield. Hi, Arthur. Thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. And so, as people start logging on, we definitely want to be able to take your questions. I'm sure there are many questions given that we're seeing the majority of the workforce now eligible to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And we're seeing that on April 5th, anyone over 18 will be eligible to get the COVID-19 vaccine in Florida. So we are discussing employee rights and employer rights. And Arthur, I'm sure you've been getting a lot of questions, as we have as well. Off the bat, can your employer require you to get the COVID-19 vaccine to come back into the building or back into a, physical workspace?
I think the short answer and the general answer is going to be yes. If we think back before the vaccines were available, it was not uncommon for an employer, depending on the nature of the industry, to test people before they came in just to make sure that they were not symptomatic of the virus. And so, in that same vein, when the employer, again, is looking to maintain a safe environment, right, not only for its clients or customers, but also for their fellow workers, they're going to be able to require the vaccine before they allow certain folks to return.
And I just want to say hi to Kathy, Bill, Dan, Julie. Thank you all so much for joining us. You can ask questions as well, please. Anyone who's viewing can definitely ask questions. My next follow-up question to that, Arthur, if you, for some reason, either you have gotten the vaccine or you haven't gotten the vaccine and you still feel like you're nervous about coming back into the office, can your employer make accommodations for you? Would they be required to work with you, or in what cases can they work with you? What cases do you have those rights?
Yeah, so that's going to be a very fact-specific inquiry. I'll give you two extreme examples. If you're working in a newsroom and you're doing a cast on Facebook Live, and you're able to just as easily do that from your home as it would be your office where your employer is located, certainly you can ask the employer to say, look, I have a concern or I have a heightened susceptibility to the virus, so I'm asking to stay home. I'm asking for a reasonable accommodation. That assumes that the employee is covered as a disabled person. You flip that around, the other extreme being you're a server in a restaurant, you're a bartender in a restaurant, you're not going to be able to ask for work from home because it's simply a requirement of the job for you to be there. So a lot of that is going to be fact specific on the industry, fact specific on the employer, and fact specific on the employee, because until that employee qualifies as someone who is, as the ADA defines disabled, you don't get to the question of a reasonable accommodation. So there has to be a qualifying disability before that inquiry or request for the reasonable accommodation can occur.
So you have to have some sort of underlying condition or some type of some type of illness that goes ahead and qualifies you to fit under that Disabilities Act.
That's correct.
And I want to get to Lisa's question. She's asking what many of us are asking: what about your constitutional rights? We hear HIPAA all the time saying, hey, they can't force you medically to do any kind of thing. Where are your constitutional rights here?
So your constitutional rights with a private employer don't exist. The constitutional rights apply when the government is taking action. And in a situation like this, when you're talking about, even if you work for a municipality, you work for a county, you work for a city, you're not going to have any constitutional right to either refuse the vaccine but force me to take me back into the workplace. There's no constitutional right there. So exercising your right to not take the vaccine or get the vaccine, which everyone has, it's not a constitutional right, but no one can force you to do that, is going to have certain ramifications. If you're with an employer who's going to require it, you don't show up, my guess is you're going to find yourself in the unemployment line.
And Dan Welch has a really great question too. Does this become an issue of religion if it's against your religion to get a vaccine and your employer is saying, well, you know what, it doesn't matter, you still have to come back to work?
So that would be a similar analysis under our Americans with Disabilities Act. So he's got a religious tenant, a rule of law that will not allow him to get the vaccine. Now the question becomes, is that something the employer can accommodate? Again, if it's somewhere, if it's an employment setting where they can work from home, or it's a matter of simply turning on a screen, I would say that person is going to be in a much better position to ask for that accommodation based on his religious beliefs. If it's the other scenario, the restaurant, the server, the bartender, I think they're going to be in a much more difficult position to identify that as a reasonable accommodation.
And, like you mentioned, this really is dependent on the industry that you're in. Are you going to see, or do you already see that a lot of employers just don't want to get into this legal battle? And they're just like, for instance, in restaurant situations and bar situations where they're not going to require those employees like, hey, you have to have your card and let me see you got both vaccines. Is it going to be a don't ask, don't tell kind of situation?
I think that's probably a good way of putting it. Don't ask, don't tell. Because I can tell you that in the recent months, even with the vaccine now available, I've not come across anybody sharing with me that their employer is requiring the vaccine. Of course, we're relatively new in the vaccines, though, right? At least in terms of it being open to everyone now. Before that, we had some older workers. I would suspect most of those workers maybe didn't work because they were, 60, 65 and over. But now that it's open, I think I would still be surprised to see a particular employer saying everyone who walks through that door has to give me some proof that they've been vaccinated. Because what would be the logic or the reasoning behind that when you've got customers or clients also walking through that door that they would never have the right to make that inquiry of?
Interesting.
But I think it's going to be that don't tell, don't ask, don't tell type thing. Yeah.
Right. And, and this also goes for not just people who don't want to get the vaccine, but what if you got the vaccine and now you're working in an environment where you're working with other people who don't have the vaccine? I mean, we've already seen how there's going to be a section of the stadium in Miami for the Heat games that it's a vaccinated section only area, right? So, I mean, it's happening. So is it possible that people who have been vaccinated who go back to work, what kind of rights do they have to voice their concerns if they're working with other people who haven't been vaccinated, or they have concerns that they're working, among mixed groups like that?
Right.
I don't know if this is an issue yet, but clearly we're seeing that, the NBA is doing it. So
yeah. So the issue might be what kind of an environment is that employer allowing to exist? And when you're mixing people and you're not separating them, it is possible that what they're engaging in might be some violation or non-compliance with some CDC guidelines. Now, what do they do with that? An employee who has concerns, safety concerns in the workplace, can turn to OSHA, contact OSHA, let them know what's going on. OSHA has the ability to send investigators and inspectors out to certain facilities, look around, make some suggested changes for employers. They have some enforcement power, although I'll tell you it's very, very small. But that would be the avenue for someone saying, look, whether they're vaccinated or not, I'm showing up at a workplace where I'm exposed to unhealthy, unsafe conditions. And then OSHA would have the ability to make that inquiry for them.
And there's that website too, if anybody wants to go Google it and just kind of read up on it as well. Michael Canfield is asking, because the vaccines are EUAs, is that the same as an FDA approved mandatory vaccination requirement?
That's a little outside of my wheelhouse.
Okay. Well, and
Michael, I'd like to help you on that one, but I just don't know the answer to that.
And, stemming off of his question, I'm curious because we've seen how, like in the school setting, students are required to get certain vaccines to start the next grade level. And of course, parents can always fill out a waiver to waive that if they have other reasons why the child cannot get the vaccine that's required of them. Can you see that difference in the government sector to the private sector? I mean, can government jobs also start requiring these types of vaccines, and also have some sort of waiver or some, other, and they may already, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. I can see that happening just based on the example that you were talking about, where the schools have the ability for the welfare of the greater population to require certain vaccinations. Now, again, this is all new, relatively new to us. Now that the vaccines are available, could you have a governmental entity that says, look, before we let you in exposed to the large majority of our work population, we're going to require that? That's a very good question. It's an issue that I've not seen come up yet, and it wouldn't surprise me if it did.
And Dan Welch has another great question. He says he works in the hotel industry. Would guests be required to show, to have the vaccine during their stay? Or I guess he means to show that they have the vaccine during their stay.
Yeah. Dan, I think the problem there is that your employer is not going to be in a position to require guests to demonstrate that unless they have a policy that says, look, you can't stay in our facility unless you prove certain things like the fact that you've been vaccinated. But the relationship there is different, right, Dan? So you're working for an employer. So the employer can say, look, if you don't do as I ask, get the vaccine, whatever it might be, you're not coming into work today. You don't have a job. It's a little different than the relationship with the guest, where presumably, they don't have that power to refuse them access to the property. Again, unless they've got some policy that says you don't access the property without a vaccine. I mean, what did we see? What have we seen for so long, right? You can't access the property without a mask. So might an employer take that next step and say, or a hotel in Dan's situation, you're not allowed to come in unless you have proof of vaccine. I suppose that's possible. I think I would be surprised to see a lot of places, particularly hotels, folks that are trying to welcome guests back into their fold, taking such an extreme step, but it is possible.
And that in response to that, if in Dan's case the hotel he works at doesn't necessarily require guests or clients to show that they have proof of vaccination, could the employee then make the argument, well, you're not requiring guests to show it, so what difference does it make if we have it or not, if you're going to have guests coming into our hotel who you don't know if they're vaccinated?
Sure. And Michelle, that gets back to what we were just talking about a minute ago, right? So if the employer holds the employees to that certain requirement, but not the guests and the patrons that are attending, what can they do? They can maybe go to the OSHA and say, look, we've got this non-compliance with the CDC requirements. Let's make it a little more simple. Suppose the restaurant, the hotel, just ban the masks. You don't need masks at my hotel. Well, we know that that's not what the CDC is requiring. We know that's not what Palm Beach County is requiring. So yeah, they have an avenue to address that. I would, encourage them to utilize that avenue, because the direct communication interaction with the employer might not prove as successful as perhaps bringing it to OSHA's attention.
And Dolores has a great question too. So if they fire you, she's saying, can you get an employment? And I'm assuming that means if they required you to do something, you didn't get the vaccine or you didn't show proof of the vaccine and you can't come back to work, can they fire you for that? And then would you qualify for unemployment if they did fire you?
Yeah, that's a good question. What I would encourage any employee to do that's lost their job for that reason is apply. The worst thing unemployment can ever tell you is that you're ineligible for benefits. And if that's the initial determination that's made, no one should ever be concerned about that, because there is an appeal or a hearing right. And I think some of that may be fact specific. If I'll also share this. If the employee refuses to engage in a known rule or policy, that is, let's say the employer says, here's our new policy manual and you have to get vaccinated, refusing to comply with a known policy can be identified as misconduct and could result in the denial of unemployment benefits. But if it's not a policy, if it's just simply something that they've simply now put in place, not in writing anywhere, not in a handbook, and they're fired for that, I think that there's a greater likelihood that they will be eligible for those benefits. This is uncharted ground. We don't typically have employers saying you've got to do X, Y, and Z before you can come into work every day. So we'll have to see how unemployment addresses it. But I can see it going one of both. I can see it go either way in those situations.
Yeah. And, stemming off of the question about work and also travel is another big question that we're getting from viewers is, could it get to a point where you may have to even show that to your job? Like if you traveled, like, hey, because now a lot of jobs require you to get tested for COVID-19 when you come back from vacation. So could that be another situation? If you want to get PTO, like, hey, you better show that you're vaccinated. I mean, is that something they could do?
I think it is something they're going to be able to ask for and probably condition return of employment on. I can tell you from personal experience, when you're coming back into the United States after travel right now, you're required per the CDC to identify a negative test result before they'll let you back in. They're checking there at the airport now. So could I see that carrying into the employment context after someone has traveled, particularly overseas? I can. If they're traveling overseas and they get back in, because they've already taken that test, it won't be much to demonstrate to the employer because they send you it electronically to let you know that you've got a negative test.
Yeah. And Milena has a question as well. If an employer does not ask for my immunization record or hasn't before for, say, rubella or other vaccines, how can they require this new vaccine?
Well, they may be able to do that because this vaccine is a new vaccine. This is new and again uncharted grounds. Look, from the employer standpoint, their position is going to be, look, we're requiring this for safety reasons, right? We want your fellow workers to feel comfortable. We want the patrons or the customers or the clients of the business to feel comfortable. And so they've got that pressure on the one side, and the pressure on the other side, which is to not require this, frankly, just isn't that great. So I can see employers making this different, making proof of vaccine different from what we've had to prove historically.
Also, the timeline is important too. Julianne has a pretty good point. She says, I'm over 55 and can't get an appointment anywhere for the vaccine. So what if you're eligible, you want to get the vaccine, you haven't been able to? I don't see a lot of employers who've been able to set that up given the supply of the vaccine. It's not like they can set up a day where, hey, come into our building and you can get vaccinated. So can they require you to return into the building if you want the vaccine but just haven't been able to get an appointment for it?
Yeah, I don't think the unavailability of appointment times is going to make much of a difference from the employer's perspective. If that's a requirement to come back in, what I would encourage folks to do in that situation is to explain to the employer, what has happened. It's not that they're refusing to get it, but they can't get it because of simply scheduling issues. And we know that there's going to be a lot of scheduling issues because as of now, everyone who is over the age of 18 is going to be eligible. So that opens up a lot of people that are going to be wanting to get that vaccine. So yeah, we're going to have some delays in getting it. I would suggest work with the employers, see what you can do to push off whatever deadline they may be giving you. And if they're giving you a deadline, frankly, I would think that it'd be unreasonable because again, you're going to have people that have access and then people that don't have access, and they shouldn't be penalized for that.
And I just want to circle back because we did have a few people join us, in the last few minutes, Tracy being one of them. And she's talking about how she missed the beginning of the explanation, how employers can require you to get this vaccine if it's not FDA approved.
Well, Tracy, no employer could ever force anybody to get a vaccine. What they have over the employee is the continued employment, right? No one is actually going to, pin an employee down, inject a needle in their arm. No one has that power over any individual. But they can also condition the return of employment on you getting that vaccine or some demonstrated proof of being asymptomatic or not having the virus at all. We said it earlier in the cast. If you think about before the vaccines were available, employers were requiring masks. No one can force any person to wear a mask, but the employer can say, look, if you're not going to do that, this is not your place of employment any longer. And, now you have to find work elsewhere.
Right. So in other words, you have the right to refuse the vaccine if that's your choice, but the employer has a right to say, if you're going to return into our building and work with other employees or clients or guests, then you have to be vaccinated or you have to show proof of vaccination. If you don't want to do that, then you can't work here any longer. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely right. Yep.
Okay. And I have a follow-up question to that. So, all this time we have seen different groups have become eligible to get the vaccine. What if you have been among those groups and you just chose to not get the vaccine, but you were already back in the building, you've already been working, and now the employer, like 3 months later, because now the vaccine is available to anyone over 18 come April 5th, can say, well, now we're going to implement a new policy, even though you've been here every day working and you had access to the vaccine and you didn't take it. Now we're saying that you have to have it. Can they go back and say that, even though the person's already been in and out of the building?
Yeah. So Michelle, your question is, can they change the way they operate? And the answer to that is yes. I mean, the employer can impose new obligations to employees at any time that it sees fit. And I know that may sound very unfair and certainly sounds unfair in the way you presented it, but let me explain to you why they're going to be able to do that. In almost every employment relationship, certainly all those in the private sector, It's governed and controlled by what's known as the at-will doctrine. And the at-will doctrine allows an employer and an employee to end that relationship at any point in time that it feels it wants to, as long as it's not for some protected illegal reason. Imposing a requirement for someone to come in either demonstrating proof that they had the vaccine or demonstrating proof that they don't have the virus is not any protected illegal reasoning. So an employer is able to take that reasoning, one that we may disagree with, a change of policy, right? I've been here for a year or so, or I've been here for 8 months and it's been no problem. Why are you changing this policy? They can do that, and the employee can suffer the consequences if they choose not to get vaccinated.
Another question someone had brought up is pregnant women. If they are concerned and there's not a lot of research out there about whether or not it's safe for pregnant women to get the vaccine. I mean, we've heard that it is, but there isn't, the numbers aren't just there, the studies aren't there yet. Do those women have any rights to do they fall under the Disabilities Act to say, hey, I don't feel safe returning to the workplace?
Yeah, not our Disabilities Act, but we do have laws that protect against pregnancy and require certain, if of course they're pregnant, that they wouldn't qualify otherwise, accommodations to allow someone to work through their pregnancy in an employment setting. So you've got a situation like that where someone's really concerned about the effects of maybe not only on her as a person, but the child that she's bearing. There may be an opportunity for them to say, look, this is my concern. I would like an accommodation. Let me come back to work without proof of the vaccine, but maybe have me work over here in some isolated area where I'm not around people. Or our other example, let me continue to work from home.
Wonderful. I really appreciate all your time, Arthur. I mean, there's so many questions I'm sure that people are going to continue to come up with in the next couple of days and weeks as we see, employers navigate this new territory, right? That's what we've been doing for a year, basically. Anything else that you want to leave people with? If they're iffy about what their rights are, is there a website they can go to, or just kind of in general what they can research to learn more if they have a specific situation?
Well, if they're looking for the accommodations that we were talking about earlier, the agency there to contact would be the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Miami. We also have a local Palm Beach County Office of Equal Opportunity here that would be another resource. But here's what I would encourage people to do. If you're having an issue with your employer, be cautious in how you communicate and address this with the employer, because remember, we're dealing with the at-will doctrine, and people can lose their jobs for many nonsensical reasons that we wouldn't agree would form the basis of the separation, but the employer has the ability to do that. So if you're not finding yourself being effective in your communications with your employer, see an employment lawyer. Go talk to somebody, find out what rights you in your particular situations you may have, and then perhaps have your counsel deal with your employer and get you what you're ultimately looking for.
And just one thought I want to leave with too, in the situation, I mean, I'm sure most employers are hoping that their employees get the vaccine so that everyone can return to work safely. Can they offer incentives to employees in order to get the vaccine?
Yeah, they can, they can offer the carrot and the stick, right? The stick being, if you don't have it, you don't have a job. The carrot being, look, if you go get it, you'll get extra days PTO, you'll get a bonus in your paycheck. Absolutely, that would be perfectly legal. I've not seen it yet, but again, this is all kind of new, right? And so would it surprise me to see that? It wouldn't at all.
All right. Thank you so much, Arthur. Have a great day. I appreciate you. Thank you
You're
all so much
welcome.
for tuning in and for asking your questions. Have a great day.
Thank you.